European entry and colonization of Nigeria. Before the Europeans arrived, Nigeria was home to diverse and sophisticated civilizations such as the Nok, Ife, Benin, and Kanem-Bornu. These societies were organized around trade, governance, and cultural practices that thrived for centuries. The Niger River, a key geographical feature, acted as both a trade route and a source of sustenance, connecting various kingdoms. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to arrive in the 15th century, establishing trade links along the West African coast. Initially interested in gold and spices, they soon turned to the transatlantic slave trade, fostering alliances with local leaders to secure human cargo for plantations in the Americas. Over the next centuries, other European powers, including the British, Dutch, and French, joined the lucrative trade. Coastal cities like Lagos and Calabar became major hubs, and local economies increasingly centered around slavery. This period reshaped traditional power dynamics, as some African states, like the Oyo Empire, grew wealthy through participation in the trade. The slave trade devastated many Nigerian communities. Population loss, internal wars, and social upheaval weakened traditional structures and left lasting scars on the region's development. By the early 19th century, Britain, under moral and economic pressures, began to abolish the transatlantic slave trade. This marked a significant shift in European-African relations. The British Royal Navy patrolled the West African coast to suppress slave trading activities. With the decline of the slave trade, Europeans turned to legitimate trade in goods like palm oil, a crucial resource for the Industrial Revolution. The Niger Delta became a focal point for palm oil production, fostering new forms of economic dependency on European markets. Christian missionaries, particularly British ones, played a pivotal role in shaping Nigeria during this period. They introduced Western education, Christianity, and medical services, which had both liberating and colonial undertones. Schools established by missionaries, such as the Church Missionary Society, CMS, produced early Nigerian elites like Herbert Macaulay. The establishment of trading companies like the United Africa Company, UAC, increased British dominance in the region. The British government supported these companies, leading to the gradual erosion of local sovereignty. In 1861, Britain annexed Lagos, citing the need to suppress slavery and protect trade routes. This marked the beginning of formal British political control over parts of Nigeria. The annexation laid the groundwork for expanding influence into the interior regions. The Berlin Conference formalized the division of Africa among European powers, and Nigeria was allocated to Britain. This event accelerated the British consolidation of control over Nigerian territories. The Royal Niger Company, led by George Goldie, secured treaties with local chiefs, effectively granting Britain control over trade and governance along the Niger River. This company laid the foundation for colonial administration. The British employed military force to subdue resistant kingdoms, including the Sokoto Caliphate, Benin Kingdom, and Igbo communities. The infamous 1897 punitive expedition against Benin is a notable example, resulting in the looting of the kingdom's art treasures. In 1914, the British amalgamated the northern and southern protectorates to streamline administration and reduce costs. This decision was driven by economic and strategic interests rather than concern for the diverse peoples of Nigeria. The amalgamation ignored Nigeria's ethnic and cultural diversity, creating a single entity with deep-seated divisions. The colonial administration relied on indirect rule, co-opting traditional leaders to enforce British policies. In the predominantly Muslim north, the British maintained the emirate system, while in the South, they introduced a hybrid system that eroded traditional authority. This dual approach created uneven development and regional disparities. Colonial Nigeria's economy was structured to serve British interests. Cash crops like cocoa, groundnuts, and rubber were cultivated for export, while infrastructure development focused on facilitating resource extraction. Colonial policies disrupted traditional economies and introduced Western education and legal systems, fostering a new class of educated elites. However, rural areas remained underdeveloped, creating economic inequalities that persist to this day. From the 19th century, Nigerians resisted colonial domination through armed uprisings and cultural preservation. Figures like Jajao of Opobo and Nana Olomu exemplified early resistance. By the early 20th century, educated Nigerians began advocating for self-rule. Organizations like the Nigerian National Democratic Party, NNDP, and later the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons, NCNC, emerged as voices of nationalism. Colonial exploitation left Nigeria dependent on monocrop agriculture and export-oriented industries. Post-independence economic struggles can be traced back to these policies. Colonization exacerbated ethnic and religious divisions as colonial boundaries ignored historical relationships among Nigeria's peoples. These divisions continue to influence Nigerian politics and society. The colonial era introduced systems of education and religion that shaped Nigeria's modern identity. Figures like Nnamdi Azikiwe, Nigeria's first president, emerged from this colonial legacy. The European entry and colonization of Nigeria were marked by exploitation, resistance, and transformation. While colonization left a lasting impact on Nigeria's political, economic, and cultural landscape, it also catalyzed the formation of a unique national identity. Understanding this history is essential for comprehending Nigeria's contemporary challenges and opportunities. The history of the transatlantic slave trade in Nigeria is a complex narrative of economic exploitation, human suffering, and cultural transformation. Nigeria, with its strategic location along the West African coast and its rich diversity of ethnic groups, became a major hub in the transatlantic slave trade, which lasted from the 15th to the 19th centuries. This trade profoundly impacted the social, political, and economic structures of the region, leaving legacies that endured to this day. The slave trade in Nigeria can be traced back to the 15th century, when Portuguese explorers first arrived along the West African coast. Initially, European interest in the region was focused on gold, ivory, and spices, but as sugar plantations in the Americas expanded, the demand for enslaved labor grew. This demand transformed the nature of European-African interactions, shifting from trade in goods to the large-scale trafficking of human beings. Local African societies had engaged in slavery long before European contact, but this form of slavery was often different in scale and purpose. Enslaved people in many African communities were typically prisoners of war, criminals, or debtors, and their roles were often integrated into the social fabric of their captors' community. The transatlantic trade, however, introduced a commodification of human beings on an unprecedented scale. Several Nigerian coastal regions became central to the transatlantic slave trade due to their strategic locations and access to inland trade networks. Notable slave ports included Lagos. Initially a fishing village, Lagos grew into a major slave trading hub by the 18th century. It became a primary departure point for enslaved Africans bound for the Americas, particularly Brazil. Badagry. Located near Lagos, Badagry was another significant port in the transatlantic trade. The town served as a key transit point where enslaved individuals were held before being shipped to the Americas. Calabar. In southeastern Nigeria, Calabar emerged as a critical slave trading port, particularly for the Efik and Ibibio peoples. European traders and African middlemen collaborated in trading enslaved individuals, often sourced from inland communities. Bonny and Brass. These Niger Delta towns became prominent in the slave trade due to their access to inland waterways, allowing for the transport of enslaved individuals from the interior to the coast. The slave trade in Nigeria was facilitated through a complex system of alliances and transactions between European traders and African elites. European powers, including the Portuguese, British, Dutch, and French, established trading posts along the Nigerian coast. These posts served as centers for the exchange of European goods, such as firearms, textiles, and alcohol, for enslaved Africans. African middlemen, often from powerful local kingdoms and trading states, played a crucial role in the trade. Kingdoms such as the Oyo Empire, the Benin Kingdom, and the Aror Confederacy actively participated in the slave trade. These entities captured and sold enslaved people, often as a result of military campaigns, raids, or the settlement of debts. The notorious Aror Confederacy, centered in southeastern Nigeria, controlled vast networks of trade routes and religious institutions. The Aror Oracle, a powerful religious institution, was used to justify the enslavement of individuals, often labeling them as criminals or spiritual outcasts. The impact on Nigerian societies. The transatlantic slave trade had profound and multifaceted effects on Nigerian societies. Population loss. Millions of Nigerians were forcibly removed from their homeland, resulting in significant population declines in certain regions. This loss of human capital hindered social and economic development. Social disruption. The trade fostered a climate of fear and instability as communities were frequently raided for captives. It also altered traditional social structures as powerful elites grew wealthy from the trade. Economic changes. While some African kingdoms profited from the slave trade, the focus on human trafficking often stifled other economic activities, such as agriculture and local industries. Cultural exchange. The forced migration of millions of Nigerians to the Americas resulted in the spread of Nigerian cultures, including Yoruba religion, language, and music, which continue to influence Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Brazilian societies. The transatlantic slave trade began to decline in the late 18th and early 19th centuries due to growing opposition from abolitionist movements in Europe and the Americas. The British, who had been major players in the trade, passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act in 1807, making it illegal to engage in the trade. The British Royal Navy began patrolling the West African coast to intercept illegal slave ships. Despite these efforts, the slave trade persisted in Nigeria well into the 19th century, particularly in regions like Lagos and Calabar. It was not until the British annexation of Lagos in 1861 and the establishment of colonial rule that the trade was effectively curtailed. However, the internal dynamics of slavery within Nigerian societies continued for decades. The transatlantic slave trade left indelible marks on Nigerian history and culture. It reshaped demographic patterns, disrupted traditional societies, and laid the groundwork for the colonial exploitation of Nigeria's resources. The diaspora created by the slave trade has also become a critical aspect of Nigerian identity, with descendants of enslaved Nigerians in the Americas maintaining cultural ties to their ancestral homeland. The memory of the slave trade is preserved in various historical sites and museums in Nigeria, such as the Slave Relics Museum in Badagry and the Point of No Return in Lagos. These sites serve as reminders of the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring impact of the transatlantic slave trade. The history of the slave trade in Nigeria is a testament to the complexities of human history, marked by tragedy, resilience, and transformation. It is a history that underscores the importance of remembering the past to understand the present and shape a more just future. Today, efforts to commemorate the victims and celebrate the cultural contributions of the Nigerian diaspora continue to highlight the enduring significance of this dark chapter in human history.